In 1983, one man received an order that would have ended all human life on Earth. He ignored it. This is the true story of the night one ordinary man saved the world. Moscow, 1983. The Cold War was at its most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Two superpowers, armed with enough nuclear weapons to end civilization 40 times over, watched each other across a hair-trigger standoff. The United States had 10,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had 8,000. Together, they could turn every city on Earth to ash, and both sides had systems designed to launch within minutes of detecting an attack. The doctrine was called mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side launched, the other would detect it and immediately launch back. Neither side could win. Everyone would die. The only safety was that nobody would ever dare press the button first. In 1983, relations between the superpowers were at breaking point. President Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Soviet leader Andropov, dying of kidney disease, genuinely believed the Americans were planning a first strike. The Soviets had deployed new SS-20 missiles aimed at Western Europe. NATO responded by deploying Pershing II missiles in West Germany, missiles that could reach Moscow in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That was all the warning anyone would get. In November 1983, NATO ran a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83. It simulated a full-scale nuclear war, including the use of actual nuclear weapons. Soviet intelligence couldn't tell if it was real or a drill. Some generals were convinced the West was about to attack. The KGB had put its entire network on high alert, specifically watching for signs of an imminent American nuclear strike. The order from the top: report anything unusual, immediately. The system was primed for catastrophe. His name was Stanislav Petrov, lieutenant colonel, 44 years old, a software engineer by training who had ended up in the Soviet early warning system by a series of accidents. He was smart, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable with the system he was responsible for. His post, Serpukhov 15, a secret bunker 60 miles south of Moscow, buried deep underground. This was the nerve center of the Soviet early warning satellite system, the facility whose job was to detect incoming American nuclear missiles and give the order to respond. The system was called OKO, Russian for eye. A network of satellites watching the United States around the clock, looking for the heat signature of launching ballistic missiles. If they detected a launch, Petrov had one job: verify and report up the chain of command immediately. Nobody outside the Soviet military knew this place existed. No sign at the gate. No acknowledgement in any public record. It was, quite simply, the most important building on Earth on the night of September 26, 1983, and Stanislav Petrov had drawn the overnight shift. He kissed his wife. He put on his uniform. It was a Tuesday. He had pulled night shifts hundreds of times before, long, boring hours watching screens that never showed anything. He had no reason to think tonight would be different. The time, 12:15 in the morning. The date, September 26, 1983. Petrov settled into his commander's chair at the center of the operations room, surrounded by screens and the quiet hum of 100 machines. It was a quiet night, for exactly 15 more minutes. His job tonight was to supervise. Not to push any buttons, just to watch, evaluate, and if anything appeared on the screens, to make a determination and report to his superiors, who would then report to the Soviet High Command, who would report to the General Secretary, who would authorize the launch. At 12:15 a.m., one of the OKO satellites sent an unusual signal, not the alarm, just a flicker. Petrov noticed it. He leaned forward slightly. In that small movement, the night changed. Then the alarm hit. A piercing electronic warning tone filled the bunker. A message flashed on the main screen in large letters: missile launch detected. One Minuteman III ICBM launched from the United States inbound. Impact estimate, 23 minutes. The operations room erupted. Technicians stood from their seats, turning to look at Petrov. Officers reached for phones. The entire room was suddenly electrified, because every person there knew exactly what the protocol was. One word from Petrov and the chain reaction would begin. The protocol was explicit: detect, verify, report. There was no protocol for think about it. There was no protocol for wait a moment. There was certainly no protocol that said A software engineer's gut feeling overrides a computer alarm. The system was designed to be faster than human doubt. 23 minutes until impact. His hand was on the reporting phone. One call. That's all it would take. One call to his superior, who would call his superior, who would brief the general secretary, who had his own finger over a very different button. Petrov did not make the call. He didn't call. Not yet. His mind was racing through everything he knew about the American nuclear doctrine, and something didn't fit. If the United States was launching a first strike, a genuine attack, why would they fire just one missile? One missile doesn't destroy the Soviet Union. One missile is not a first strike. One missile makes no strategic sense whatsoever. A real American first strike would be hundreds of missiles simultaneously. The entire U.S. arsenal launched at once to prevent Soviet retaliation. One missile doesn't end a war. It starts one. And the Americans knew that. So why would they fire just one? He remembered something. In his technical training, he had been briefed on the OCO system's vulnerabilities. One known weakness: under certain conditions, sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds could fool the satellite's sensors into seeing heat signatures that weren't there. His superior officer approached, demanding to know why he hadn't reported. Petrov held up his hand. He needed 30 more seconds. 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. The satellites were not the only detection system. Soviet ground-based radar, huge arrays of antennas pointed at the sky, should also be picking up incoming missiles by now if they were real. He called the radar operators. Their answer would tell him everything. The ground radar showed nothing. Clear sky, no incoming missiles. This was significant, but not conclusive. The radar had limitations. It might not yet have detected missiles that the satellites had picked up earlier in the flight path. It was evidence, not proof. Conflicting data. Satellites. One missile. Ground radar. Nothing. In the protocol, satellite detection was the primary trigger. He was supposed to report the satellite data. His training said, verify. His gut said, something is wrong with the satellite. He had to choose, in seconds, which one to trust. Then, the screen updated. 2 missiles, then 3. The system was now reporting a full-scale attack. 5 Minuteman, the 3 ICBMs, all inbound, all with impact times within the same window. The alarm was no longer an anomaly. It was a protocol-triggering event. 5 missiles. The entire room was now in active crisis mode. His superiors were calling him. Officers were calling past him to their own superiors. The Soviet military machine was beginning to activate around him, and still, Stanislav Petrov did not pick up the reporting phone. That telephone. That ordinary black telephone. If he picked it up and reported 5 inbound missiles, the Soviet High Command would have approximately 12 minutes to make a decision. Almost certainly, they would launch. The Soviet counter-launch would send over 1,000 warheads toward the United States. American systems would detect the launches. America would then launch its own arsenal. Within 40 minutes, every major city in both countries, and most of Europe, would cease to exist. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Washington, New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Tokyo, gone. Not damaged, gone. The nuclear winter that followed would kill the crops. The smoke would block the sun for years. The scientists had a name for what came after: nuclear winter. Nobody survives nuclear winter. He kept working the problem. When had the satellite last been calibrated? What was the solar angle at the time of detection? What were the atmospheric conditions? He was doing in 90 seconds what normally took hours of analysis, and he was doing it while the fate of the world waited. The satellite had been positioned in a way that put it between the sun and high-altitude cloud formations over North Dakota. Exactly the kind of geometrical alignment that could fool the sensors. It was possible. It was more than possible. In his gut, Petrov believed it was what had happened. He thought about his wife at home. He thought about his daughter. He thought about everyone in Moscow who was sleeping right now, unaware. He thought about the American families who were also sleeping. He made his decision. He would not report it as a genuine attack. I am classifying this as a system malfunction. The words fell into the silence of the operations room like stones into still water. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The duty commander had just overridden the most critical alarm in the Soviet nuclear system, based on his personal judgment. His subordinates stared at him, some with relief, some with horror. They were all thinking the same thing. If Petrov is right, he has saved the world. If Petrov is wrong, he has just handed the Americans a first strike without response, and the Soviet Union will be destroyed before anyone can react. Now came the longest minutes of his life. He stood and watched the screens. If the missiles were real, the ground radar would begin detecting them within minutes. If it remained clear, if the sky stayed empty, then his gut had been right. He could not know. He could only wait. 10 minutes. The missiles, if real, would have appeared on ground radar by now. Nothing. He was beginning to feel something he couldn't afford yet. Hope. 5 minutes. If missiles had been launched 23 minutes ago, Soviet radar would have been tracking them for 15 minutes by now. The sky was still clear. The ground radar showed nothing. The satellites themselves had not updated their detection. Something was wrong with the satellite. The impact time passed. Nothing. No explosions. No impact confirmations from the missile defense perimeter. The Soviet early warning system, very slowly, began to register what Petrov already knew. The alarm had been false. The missiles were not real. The world was still intact. He sat down. The tension left his body in a wave that felt physical. He was shaking slightly, not from fear but from the release of 40 minutes of absolute controlled concentration. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He was surprised. Around him, the room was exhaling. Officers slowly returning to their stations. Some stood in small groups talking quietly. The red warning lights were going dark one by one. The normal institutional fluorescent light returned, almost surreally ordinary after what just happened. The phone calls from above started arriving. His superior wanted an immediate report. His superior's superior was already on the line. The incident had been logged. The overrule had been noted. And now the Soviet military bureaucracy, which had no protocol for Lieutenant Colonel saves the world, needed to understand what had happened. He wrote his report. Every detail, every data point. His reasoning, step by step. He was a systematic man, an engineer, and he documented what he had done with the same precision he had applied to making the decision. He knew this report would be read very carefully by very powerful people. Outside the bunker, the Soviet Union slept. Millions of people who did not know that a 44-year-old engineer in a bunker 60 miles south of Moscow had just decided, alone, under impossible pressure, that they deserved to keep breathing. In the United States, no alarm had sounded. No missiles had been detected because no missiles had been launched. Americans slept in their beds that night, completely unaware that they were alive because a Soviet officer had trusted his gut over his orders. The world continued. The sun would rise in a few hours. Birds would sing. Children would go to school. None of them would know about the 40 minutes that had almost been the last 40 minutes. And the man who had made that possible would never be officially celebrated. He finished the report. He put down the pen. He had done what he believed was right. He had no way of knowing yet what it would cost him. Weeks later, Petrov sat in an investigation. Not a celebration, not a commendation ceremony, an investigation. The Soviet military needed to understand what had happened, and whether Stanislav Petrov had violated protocol. The committee had a problem. If they praised Petrov for overriding the system, they were implicitly acknowledging that the system could be wrong, and that individuals could use their judgment to override it. For a military built on absolute obedience, that was deeply uncomfortable. He didn't apologize. He explained his reasoning, the single missile anomaly, the conflicting radar data, the known satellite vulnerabilities. He told them he would make the same decision again. This did not make the committee more comfortable. They didn't punish him, but they didn't reward him either. They classified the incident at the highest level. They noted in his file that he had made errors in the logbook during the incident, a technical criticism designed to prevent him from receiving a commendation. The system had found its way to neutralize him. Officers who had done far less were decorated that year. Petrov's name was not read out. His incident was not mentioned. The Soviet military closed its ranks around the story and locked the door. They had a system. The system had malfunctioned. They would fix the satellite. The story ended there. He went home. He sat in his modest Soviet apartment with a cup of tea. He watched television. Somewhere in a classified vault, His report detailed the night that the world almost ended. Nobody was going to talk about it. Not publicly, not officially, not ever. If the Soviet military had its way. The Soviet Union continued. Millions of people who owed their lives to one man's gut feeling went about their days in complete ignorance. He passed them on the street, these people he had saved, and they had no idea who he was. He was quietly moved to a less significant posting, not officially because of the incident, officially because of the logbook errors. But the message was understood by everyone who knew. Stanislav Petrov had become inconvenient. His wife fell ill, cancer. He spent years as her caregiver, a role he performed with the same quiet dedication he had brought to everything else. While world leaders gave speeches about peace and security, Stanislav Petrov gave his wife her medication and held her hand. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The system he had served, the ideology, the military structure, the entire Cold War world, simply ceased to exist. The war he had prevented would never be fought. The enemy he had faced across missile silos became suddenly a partner. He had saved the Soviet Union. And then it ceased to exist. There is a particular kind of irony in that, the kind that takes years to properly feel. In the chaotic 1990s of post-Soviet Russia, Petrov lived on a small pension. He was not poor by the worst standards of that era, but he was far from comfortable. He lived quietly. He did not seek attention. He did not know that his story was about to escape the classified files. After the Soviet Union fell, intelligence files began to be declassified. In 1992, a retired Soviet colonel, Oleg Kalugin, confirmed the incident had happened. Slowly, the story began to leak into the historical record, and Western researchers began to realize what they were looking at. When journalists began to report the story in the late 1990s, the world received it with the kind of stunned silence that precedes enormous realization. A Soviet officer had prevented nuclear war, alone, by ignoring his orders, and nobody had known about it for 15 years. Journalists began finding him at his apartment. He was surprised by the attention, not because he doubted what he had done, but because he had assumed for 15 years that it would never matter to anyone outside a classified vault. He had saved the world in secret. Now the world wanted to meet him. He told interviewers, "I was just doing my job." He meant it literally. He genuinely believed he had simply applied professional judgment to a technical problem. He seemed almost uncomfortable with the idea that what he had done was heroic. He was an engineer. He had identified a malfunction. That was all. In 2006, he was flown to New York to be honored by the Association of World Citizens at the United Nations. He had never been outside Russia before. He arrived in New York wearing a suit that had been purchased for the occasion, carrying a small bag, looking at the Manhattan skyline with quiet wonder. He stood on a Manhattan street and looked up at the towers. This city was here, all of it, every light, every person, because of a decision he had made alone in a bunker in Russia 23 years earlier. He didn't say that to anyone. He didn't need to. They gave him a crystal statue, a commendation from the Association of World Citizens. It was not a Nobel Prize. It was not a state decoration from Russia or America. It was a small crystal object, but it was at least something. After 23 years, somebody had said, "We know what you did." He put the award on his shelf, next to the clock, next to his wife's photograph. In his small apartment, in a Russian city, on an ordinary shelf, the recognition that the world owed this man everything. When asked if he was a hero, he consistently said no. He was, he insisted, simply a man who had applied technical knowledge to a problem. But he could never explain why, when the entire system was pointing one direction, he looked the other way. He called it a gut feeling. The world calls it everything. His wife died before the world fully understood what her husband had done. She had lived with a man who had saved humanity, who had come home from a night shift and said almost nothing about it, and she had never known the full story. He carries that quietly. In 2013, Germany awarded him the Dresden Peace Prize, one of the few formal recognitions that attempted to match the scale of what he had done. He donated the $25,000 prize money, saying he had no use for it in his old age. He returned to his apartment. He continued to live quietly. Look at these photographs. A young Soviet officer, proud in his uniform. A middle-aged man in a plain jacket, slightly bewildered by attention. An old man with a crystal award on his shelf. The same eyes in all of them, steady, evaluating, quietly certain of what they know. He lived in Fryazevo, a small town outside Moscow. Not the kind of place where world historical figures retire, a place with apartment blocks and bus stops and small shops. He was simply a man who lived there, and happened to have the most important night of the 20th century in his past. His pension was small. His apartment needed repairs he couldn't afford. The man who saved 8 billion lives, including every world leader who gave speeches about peace that year, did not have reliable hot water. The distance between what he had done and what the world had given him back is a precise measurement of how the world values things. He was asked about bitterness. He thought about it carefully. He always thought carefully, and said no. Not because the world had been fair to him, but because resentment would have required him to spend energy on it, and he didn't see the point. He was not a man who wasted things. 8 billion people. That's the current estimate of human lives that depend on what happened in that bunker. Because the nuclear winter triggered by a full exchange would have collapsed agricultural systems worldwide, not just in the targeted nations. He didn't save one country. He saved the species, these hands. He never picked up the reporting phone. In the language of history, not doing something is almost never remembered as the act of courage it sometimes is. He exercised restraint under the most extreme pressure imaginable, and in doing so, kept the world turning. He slept, an old man in a chair in a quiet town. Outside his window, the world continued, enormous, loud, alive, and utterly unaware that it owed its continuation to this specific sleeping man. That asymmetry between what he had done and what he was given back is the truest thing about this story. Act 4. The System, the Science, and the Near Miss. The satellite that nearly ended the world was called Cosmos 1382. It was part of the OCO network, a series of satellites in highly elliptical orbits designed to watch the United States from above and detect the heat signatures of launching missiles. It was, by Soviet standards, state-of-the-art. The false alarm was caused by a rare alignment. The satellite was positioned at an angle where sunlight, reflected off high-altitude cloud formations over North Dakota, created an infrared signal that the satellite's sensors interpreted as a missile launch plume. Nature, briefly, looked like war. Malmstrom Air Force Base, home to the 341st Missile Wing, with its real Minuteman missiles in their real silos. The satellite had pointed its sensors exactly here and seen exactly the wrong thing. The most dangerous false alarm in history came from a very ordinary piece of bad lighting. The system had a known flaw. It could be fooled by certain atmospheric conditions. Engineers had flagged it. The fix had been delayed. Budgets, priorities, Soviet bureaucratic timelines. The flaw that had been scheduled to be corrected had not yet been corrected on September 26, 1983. The American system had more redundancy. Multiple independent detection systems that had to agree before any alarm was considered confirmed. The Soviet system, by contrast, had placed enormous trust in the OCO satellites and enormous responsibility on the officer who received their data. Declassified documents later showed that Soviet engineers knew the OCO system had error-prone detection algorithms. The false alarm rate had been higher than publicly acknowledged. Petrov, who had been involved in developing the system's procedures, knew this. His knowledge of the system's weaknesses was part of what made him doubt the alarm. Had Petrov reported the alarm, military analysts estimate the Soviet response would have been launched within 12 minutes. American systems would have detected the Soviet launches and triggered an American counter-launch. The exchange that didn't happen would have involved over 2,000 warheads. The nuclear winter studies, published in the 1980s by Carl Sagan and others, concluded that a full U.S.-Soviet exchange would inject enough soot and debris into the stratosphere to reduce global temperatures by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Agriculture would collapse. Billions who were not killed by the weapons would die of starvation. The specific missiles the satellite reported as launched were real missiles at a real base. They were armed, ready, maintained. They just hadn't moved. The satellite had found a ghost signal in sunlight, and the entire world had come within one man's decision of responding to it as if it were real. 60 feet underground, inside reinforced concrete, behind multiple security checkpoints, in a room of screens and ringing phones, that is where the 21st century was preserved. Not in a parliament, not in a palace, not in a summit meeting. in a bunker by one man in 40 minutes of controlled doubt. The logbook entry exists. In an archive somewhere, a few lines in Petrov's neat handwriting, recording an event that changed everything, annotated with a minor administrative criticism that was used to prevent him from being officially commended. The most important logbook entry in history, filed under error. It is almost certainly not in your history textbooks. The Cuban Missile Crisis is there. The Berlin Wall is there. The Marshall Plan, the space race, détente, all there. The night in 1983 when one Soviet officer prevented the actual nuclear war that the entire Cold War was supposedly about, not mentioned. Every year some student finds this story for the first time, and every year they have the same reaction. Disbelief that it's real, then disbelief that they'd never heard it, then a slow dawning awe at the contingency of everything, at how different the world could have been based on one man's 40 minutes. In 2014, Danish filmmaker Peter Anthony made a documentary called The Man Who Saved the World. Petrov attended the premiere. He watched his own story on screen, the story he had carried alone for 30 years, and reportedly wept. He had never quite seen it from the outside before. He watched footage of 1983. Reagan on television, Soviet military parades, the world as it had been on the night he'd made his decision, and his face, watching it, carried something that looked like grief for the world that had been, and quiet, private gratitude that it had been allowed to continue. The documentary showed the world something important. Not a monument, not a ceremony, not an officially sanctioned hero. Just a man in a small apartment with a shelf, a pension, and a story that contained everything. Serpukhov 15 still exists as a military facility. You cannot visit it. There is no plaque at the gate, no marker, no guided tour of the operations room where the world was preserved. The most important room in modern history remains classified. Some things apparently still don't need to be remembered. After his death, his belongings were carefully preserved. The Crystal Award, the documents, the photographs of the night that history tried to forget. These objects will outlast the systems that tried to bury the story, the governments that classified it, and the medals that were given to men who did far less. From space, the Earth is a thin bubble of air and water on a rock. Everything we have built, everyone who has ever lived, every song, every book, every city, it all exists in a layer thinner than the skin of an apple. Stanislav Petrov looked at an alarm on a screen and decided that bubble deserved to continue. That moment, his hand hovering, then choosing. In the history of the 20th century, a century of extraordinary violence and extraordinary achievement, that moment may be the most consequential 5 seconds that nobody watched. On May 19, 2017, Stanislav Petrov died at his home in Fryazevo. He was 77 years old. He died quietly, alone in his apartment. He had been ill. Nobody made an announcement. The world did not pause to mark the moment. His death was not announced for months. His family, estranged and small, did not make a public statement immediately. It was only in September 2017 that international media confirmed he had died, when a German activist who had been in touch with him realized they'd lost contact. The world's reaction to learning of his death was extraordinary, not because it was large, but because so much of it came from people encountering his story for the very first time. They found it, they were staggered by it, and they mourned a man they had discovered and lost in the same afternoon. The reaction is almost always the same. First, disbelief. Then, a check that it's really true. Then, the dawning understanding of what the story means, not just historically, but personally. Because every person who reads this story is alive because of it. His grave is simple, unremarkable, a stone with his name and dates. Nothing that tells you what lies beneath the surface. Not just a man, but the reason the world is still here to put flowers on graves. After 1983, the Cold War continued for another 8 years. The wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. Democracy spread. The world that had been locked in a nuclear standoff began, slowly, to breathe again. None of those developments could have happened if a Soviet bunker had gone differently on a September night. Everything that has happened since 1983, every scientific discovery, every work of art, every child born, every election, every football match, every sunrise watched from a window, required that one man to doubt a computer alarm. We live in the world of his doubt. Think about your own life, the moments that matter to you, the people you love. Every single one of those things, every moment of your own existence since September 1983, is downstream of what he chose in those 40 minutes. Every UN resolution passed since 1984, every climate summit, every peace treaty, every declaration of human rights. They all required the world to still exist. He made that possible. He was never invited to address the room. There are still approximately 12,500 nuclear weapons in the world today. About 2,000 of them are on high alert, ready to launch in minutes. The conditions that produced the 1983 false alarm, satellite errors, rapid decision timelines, single points of human judgment, still exist in various forms. The fundamental architecture of nuclear risk has not changed as much as we would like to believe. There are still early warning systems. There are still duty officers. There are still situations where an individual human being has to make a decision about ambiguous data in a very short window of time. The 1983 incident was not unique. In the same year, Soviet naval officer Vasily Arkhipov had prevented nuclear launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In November 1983, Able Archer came terrifyingly close to triggering a real Soviet preemptive strike. The world skates close to the edge with uncomfortable regularity. Look at the lights. Every city, every country, every light is a person, and every person is a story, and every story required the world to still be here. The probability that we are all here, living these stories, was reduced to near zero on September 26, 1983. And then rescued by one man who decided to think for himself. Every person born after 1983 exists because of what he did, and the children of those people, and their children. The generational multiplication of his decision runs into the billions, an expanding wave of existence that began with one man not picking up a telephone. From the moon, the earth is a small blue marble. Carl Sagan called it a pale blue dot. He said, everyone who ever lived, every king and peasant, every act of heroism and villainy, all of it on that point of light. Stanislav Petrov made sure that point of light was still there to see. He said in his last major interview, "I made a decision, and I was lucky." That was how he characterized it. Not heroism, not genius. Luck. The luck of being the right kind of person, with the right kind of knowledge, in the right place, at the moment the world needed exactly those qualities. The sun rises over Russia every morning. The same sun that confused a satellite 40 years ago, that triggered the alarm that one man chose to disbelieve. The same sun that now rises on a world of 8 billion people, none of whom were promised this sunrise, all of whom got it anyway. He lived with it on a shelf. The award that couldn't hold the weight of what it was given for. The photographs of people who didn't know what he had preserved. The clock, still counting the seconds. All of them downstream of one decision. All of them running on borrowed time he gave the world. The snow falls on Fryazevo. On the apartment block. On the window of the room where he slept in his chair. Where he kept the award on the shelf. Where he lived out his quiet years in the world he had saved and been forgotten by. The snow doesn't know any of this. It falls anyway. The world is still here. 8 billion people are still here. Because of one decision made in 40 minutes by one man in the dark. The question is this: how many other decisions, happening right now in rooms we don't know about, are standing between us and the edge?